I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is part 2 of our sort of mini-series on Bai Juyi. Last week's podcast was on just a kind of seasonal poem.
Autumn Thoughts from Far Away.
This week, we're turning to Bai Juyi's more political poetry. We didn't really talk about this last week, but Bai Juyi could be a very political poet. He had a position in the government. He was actually exiled. He got involved in a controversy or multiple controversies over politics. He angered the wrong people.
Yes, but unlike some other figures from his era, he was also extremely popular as a poet.
Today, I would say he's still very popular, so surprisingly in China and in the American Academy. I couldn't really find that much on him in English as I was preparing for this podcast, but he's super, super popular in Japan still.
You know, when he gets kind of polemical, and we are talking about a fairly polemical poem today, you're looking at a very different poet. Assuming you listened to the last podcast, you will have heard Lee and me kind of discuss at length, what do we do with this line?
There's no question about
that is
what
not
to
the
do.
case. Yeah, that is not the case with this one. It is, although I will say, and then we're going to jump into the poem, my lead-in comment is that it's a pretty strong narrative. It's a fairly well-written story, which is interesting. Not the kind of thing I'm used to.
The poem itself.
The poem is,
yes,
the poem is. Thank you, yes. It's in the poem form, but it's a very interesting narrative.
I think the cool thing about this little mini-series that we're doing is that last week we kind of saw the Li Bai version of Bai Juyi. And this week I think we're seeing the more political, historical Du Fu Bai Juyi. Bai Juyi is born after both of these poets have kind of reached their apex and have become like the two greats of the Tang Dynasty. And in Bai Juyi we kind of see them poetically being melded together into a single poet.
Yes, in the sense that Du Fu tended to write more about current events than Li Bai. No, in the sense that the current events poems that Bai Juyi was writing were nowhere near as complex as Du Fu's. But in many ways, they're more affecting because of their narrative quality. So why don't I just go ahead and read very quickly the poem, because it's not very long and it's a pretty tight narrative. So we are once again using the David Hinton translation. In English, it's an old charcoal seller.
In Chinese, it's 卖炭翁.
So I'm going to read it real quick. An old charcoal seller cuts firewood and sears it to charcoal below South Mountain. His face smeared with dust and ash the color of wood smoke, his hair gone grizzled and gray, his 10 fingers utter black, and yet daring such hopes for the profits he'll take home once the charcoal's all sold. Warm robes to wear, food to eat. His clothes are worn so miserably thin, and yet he worries, charcoal's selling too cheap. So he hopes for colder weather. Then one night, an inch of snow falls in the city's foothills, and at dawn, he takes his cart crackling through ruts of ice. A tired ox and hungry man. The sun is already high when they pause to rest in marketplace mud outside the south gate, and 2 riders no one knows appear in a dashing flourish. One, an envoy dressed in yellow, the other, a servant in white. The envoy carries an imperial warrant, and after sighting it, he chases the ox away, turns the cart, and takes it off north. A cart like that easily carries 1,000 pounds of charcoal, but a palace envoy hurries it away without a second thought. Half a length of crimson lace and a few yards of fine damask draped over the old ox's neck. Isn't that a fair enough price? Now, this is written in a period when the powers that be in the imperial court, especially the eunuchs, kind of have it their own way, especially with regards to purchasing things in public, and that's a little bit what Bai Juyi is referring to.
Interesting, Rob. I think you're totally right. In fact, Bai Juyi himself, he actually wrote just a single 4-character sentence of commentary on this very poem. It was 苦拱事业. So it's on the miserableness or misery caused by the palace and the market. He doesn't pull any punches in this poem, does he?
No, and in fact, one of the things I found really interesting is the sarcasm in the poem. The very last line. Isn't that a fair enough
sarcastic.
Price?
It's
like,
so
yeah,
ironic.
they just threw this cloth at him. That's good, right? 1,000 pounds of charcoal. I think that totally evens out. I'm not exactly a lifelong scholar of the Tang Dynasty, so maybe there's tons of poems like this. But when I read Du Fu, I don't see this kind of sarcasm. Du Fu wasn't nearly that snarky about the court. Bai Juyi clearly is.
you can see how he kind of got exiled. He had when you talk like that, when you're that cutting with your irony, talking about the imperial court, you can see how you would rub some people the wrong way. And I'm a little surprised he kept his head.
Now, Bai Juyi is here very, very descriptive. I would say that that's also something, I won't say unique to him, but as we get into the song and the types of poetry people use start to really broaden out, I think you see a little more of that. But the Tang Dynasty is mostly, the great sort of poets of the Tang Dynasty, Li Bai, Du Fu, they're known for their concision, right? So taking a lot of stuff and compressing it into a small space and getting across a huge point in just a few lines. Bai Juyi is really letting himself go with this one. He's really describing the heck out of the charcoal seller with the color of his fingers and his hair and what kind of robes he hopes he'll get and the whole thing, the cart crackling through ruts of ice. The whole thing is meant to give you this very clear portrait of this guy's life is not very good. What's interesting is that I think when you read it this way in poetry sort of line stanza form, it almost reads like free verse, at least in Hinton's translation. I know you can translate it differently so that it does rhyme. But the descriptiveness is important because it's going to signal readers to a couple of things. One, that this is supposed to be a poet who really pays attention. He doesn't just say, hey, a charcoal seller got ripped off. Doesn't that suck? Because there are short forms of poetry when he probably could have done that. But he describes and describes and describes the charcoal seller, which means he's really observing what's going on with the people around him, not just knowing that they exist. And that's pretty important.
So, Rob, you mentioned the English translation feels better as translated as free verse, though he is not writing in anything like free verse in the original, right?
No,
this
of course not.
A traditional 7-character line poem that each line is 7 characters and the first 4 kind of deliver a point and then it's kind of resolved in the last 3 characters, and each line to a certain degree functions that way. Rob, why this particular poem? Because Bai Juyi has so many different discussions of highly politicized subjects. This is not the poem that got him exiled, I don't think. That was a different poem. But why this poem?
Partly because it's the easiest to present for this side of his writing. At least, he wrote so many, we could probably have picked many, many more. But this one was really striking to me because, A, of the description, and B, of the sarcasm at the end of the poem, because he's really presenting himself as a poet of the people here, not of the court, which is a fairly unique position. Yeah, at the time, I don't think you would have tried to present yourself that way, at least if you wanted to get anywhere. You wouldn't want the court to be your enemy, but he's clearly doing that here. His descriptions are vivid and his sarcasm is biting. I think that's the best introduction you can get to this side of his poetry because it is, as we mentioned before, doesn't require a lot of in-depth commentary to get the point.
I wonder, we've talked about, so I suggested that Bai Juyi was kind of this melding of Du Fu and Li Bai into a single poetic figure. You also mentioned that he's kind of anticipating stuff going on that's going to happen more in the song. So whereas the Tang Dynasty was kind of concise, the song is more descriptive and long-winded. Is Bai Juyi the everybody poet that he kind of represents all of these different styles? He has a little bit of Li Bai in him. He has a little bit of Du Fu in him, but also he's kind of showing how the song is going to develop in its poetry. Is that what you make of Bai Juyi?
More or less, and maybe this is one of the reasons why you don't see more about him, is when you're dabbling in a lot of different styles and your goal is not to perfect the style, but to sort of get a point across, it tends to come across that you're more of a dilettante than a sort of a poetic master. Like Du Fu used a ton of different styles, but he was so good at the form that he was effectively kind of a master of all, right? Bai Juyi is just a lot more rambling with these styles.
Bai Juyi has been called the Shixian, that is the god of poetry by some. But today I think that he has largely been, I don't want to say forgotten, because he's definitely not been forgotten, but he's been relegated to a sort of Tang Dynasty second tier. I would say he's even below Wang Wei in the sort of Tang Dynasty hierarchy. Do you think that every poet quality, the fact that he is so hard to place in this kind of web of literature in between the Tang and the Song, in between Li Bai and Du Fu. Is that the reason why he's kind of been relegated to a lower tier status?
Maybe, or are we dealing with an early form of message fiction or message poetry, which we've both agreed is typically really bad, right? If his point is to draw attention to the plight of the everyman, maybe his poetry sort of suffers as a result. It's very, very hard to do this stuff very well. Du Fu embarks on that here and there, but typically leaves the politics more below the surface. Bai Juyi puts it right in your face. I feel like I'm not enough of an expert on this to comment on just how good, line by line, this poetry is. But I will say that typically when it's message first, it doesn't last as long, doesn't read as well.
You and I are both not socialist, at least in that way. We don't believe that the message is more important than the medium. And we don't believe good literature is ever focused on the point that you're trying to get across over the aesthetics. Rob, do you like this poem?
I do, but I don't like it in the same way that I would like, say, some of the best poems by Li Bai or Su Shi. I'm fascinated by how narrative it is and how well it works. He still leaves some things under the table. On first reading, you don't necessarily catch that the envoy from the palace is just taking the charcoal and saying, beat it, right? He's not giving him anything. Bai Juyi just sort of leaves you that last snarky comment as a reminder that, yeah, no, he didn't get paid. He just got kicked out of the way.
Rob, I think that's a great place to end it. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts?
Just that I really like the David Hinton translation. Definitely check it out if you can find it.
That's in Classical Chinese Poetry, David Hinton's collection of translations.
That's the name of the book. Also, remember to look for us on social media. Twitter at ChinLitPod, Instagram at ChineseLitPod. And of course, we're also still on Patreon at Chinese Literature Podcast.
Buy us beer.
And make sure you give us a shout out, review us, tell everybody how brilliant, amazing, I was going to say handsome, but they can't see us, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, we definitely have faces made for podcasting.
Absolutely do. So, but yeah, give us a review. Get the word out on whatever your favorite podcasting platform is.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.